Hey guys, this is Tim from Rennline. We're going to be installing this 75mm lift kit on this 955 Cayenne, and our goal is to fit these 33-inch tires. Let's get to it. All right guys, first step is to obviously put the car up in the air and then take the wheels off. Once you're there, we're gonna be installing these body spacers. They go in between the subframe and the body of the vehicle. You're gonna remove the factory bolt and then install the longer bolts that are provided with the kit. Once you have the longer bolts installed, you're gonna install the body spacer one by one. Once you have the body lift installed, you're gonna go ahead and start on the rear. You're gonna wanna loosen all the different pivot bolts to allow enough droop for the suspension to come out easily. Before you loosen any of your bolts, you're gonna wanna go ahead and mark all of your eccentric bolts to make sure you get everything in the ballpark when you put everything back together. Next step is you want to disconnect the lower shock bolt, which will release the sway bar. You can see we already did that. And then up here, you'll find 4 more bolts holding the shock to the body. Once you have all these bolts removed, you'll be able to take the shock assembly out of the car, separate the top hat from the main shock assembly, and install this in between. Now that you have the shock assembly out of the car, you're going to want to mark the center. You want to put a mark on the top hat, the top of the shock assembly, one of the spring coils, and then the body of the shock. This is just going to make sure everything's lined up properly when you put it back together. This is a 2-piece system. You're going to remove these 4 bolts and then slide this spacer in between. So now that you have the top hat separated from the main shock assembly, you're going to take our spacer, place it right on top, and then install the included hardware. Now that the spacer's installed onto the shock assembly, we're going to take the included hardware and some Loctite and install these studs onto our spacer. Just as a note, these nuts are going to be torqued to 32 foot-pounds, and same with these studs. Now that you have everything torqued down to 32 foot-pounds, we're going to take our top hat, place it right on top of the studs that we just installed, and take your factory hardware and also tighten this down to 32 foot-pounds. Now that everything's torqued down, we're going to go ahead and put it in the car. But one thing to note is that your center line is now off center. But don't worry, we're going to fix it when it's in the car. The 4 bolts for the upper strut mount is very difficult to install yourself. I would grab a friend, maybe even 2, and just wrestle that thing on there. I talked about previously about how the shock is not going to be clocked right. We're going to go ahead and clock it back to center. To get the strut back to center, you're going to take a big screwdriver, stick it in the strut mount, and just pull until it's close to center. Now that the top of the strut is secured and the strut is now centered. You're gonna reinstall the bottom bolt for the strut going through the sway bar. And you may be wondering why we loosened every pivot point. It's so we can load the suspension properly before torquing everything down to spec. That way you don't ruin any of your bushings. So now that the shock assembly's in and your bottom bolt is secured with your sway bar link, you're gonna go ahead and realign all of these camber bolts and tighten down everything to factory spec. All right, so now that everything's torqued to the factory setting in the rear, we're gonna start on the front suspension. All right, so now that we're up front, we're gonna go ahead and start by removing all these wires from their holders. One's for the wheel speed sensor and the other one's for the brake sensor. Now we're gonna remove the sway bar end link from the strut. We're gonna go ahead and disconnect the upper control arm from the upright. It's an 18 millimeter. If your upper control arm doesn't release from the upright, you're gonna just take the biggest hammer you got, pop right out. So we're gonna go ahead and disconnect the shock mount bolt. It's gonna be 221 millimeters. Now with the car lowered, we're gonna get in the engine bay and remove all these plastic fascia pieces so we can remove the 3 bolts holding the strut to the body. So now that the plastic fascia is removed, we can access the bolts. There's one here, one right underneath the coolant reservoir, and then one back behind the firewall, and it's deep in front of the, I believe it's an air filter cover. Now that we have the strut assembly out of the car, we're gonna go ahead and remove these 4 bolts from the top hat to separate the 2. Now that you have the top hat off of the main strut assembly, we're gonna bash out these studs. Just take a hammer and... What we're doing next is we're gonna take the included hardware with our kit and getting the stack correct. We're gonna go with spacer, top hat, and then we're gonna just slide these bolts through. And then at the end, we're gonna secure everything with the factory hardware that we just took off the studs. So now that you got your stack all correct and everything's torqued down, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall this on the car. This is the point of the install where I suggest grabbing a friend to help thread in one of the top bolts for the strut mount. So at this point, we're gonna just reassemble everything as it came off. All right, so it looks like I got some cutting to do, but that wraps up the install for the 75mm lift kit. If you like this product and you want to see more, check us out at Rennline.com.